What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Tonight, we're going to be taking a look at a pastor's sermon. Now, I've cut this sermon down from 40 minutes to about 10, and he's going to be explaining why atheism is incoherent with science, with mathematics, and boy, is he gonna try to explain probability. So, if you guys want to fuck around and find out how bad this pastor is at explaining any of these topics, then please stay tuned. All right, so getting on into the video. Now, this is random pastor from South Dakota. It's Sioux Falls Church is the church. I actually have a link in the description of the video that we're responding to. The church name is Hillcrest Church, and it's a little confusing. I think maybe they went through a name change or something like that. But anyways, he has a point to make, but he's not going to be making it very well.
Interesting, right? So they would say that obviously their thing is ridiculous. They admit that it's ridiculous. There is no evidence that the flying spaghetti monster exists. Since there is no evidence for it, it's obvious it does not exist. At least the probability of it is so incredibly low.
Yeah, so he was kind of complaining before this. He was complaining about the flying spaghetti monster and how that was created to combat creationism. He was really upset about it.
And if there is no evidence that God exists, then he does not exist. Or at least the probability is very, very low.
This is where I fall on this. If there's no evidence to believe in something, then why should I believe it? It's not really a matter of probability for me. Like, it's not a matter of probability for me to believe in whether or not I believe in the flying spaghetti monster. There's no evidence that a flying spaghetti monster exists, so therefore I don't believe in it. It's not that the probability of his existence is like really low, so I don't believe in it. It's just that there's no good reason to believe in it for me. So it's not really a matter of probability at that point. You can make a probabilistic argument if you wanted to, but you'd really just be pulling numbers out of your ass and making some shit up at that point. So I don't see the benefit in being hyper specific to the point of like probabilistic nature of the flying spaghetti monster. I think that all you have to do is look at what the evidence is, and since there is no evidence, then there is no reason to believe in whatever the fuck you're saying.
When it comes to things like the argument made by Russell's Teapot or the flying spaghetti monster, I really wonder how people have asked the wrong question for so many years, and not known that that when you're challenged philosophically like this, that there is an obvious question that would be in front of all of us that if we don't ask, we're going to get to the wrong answer. And I'm not saying this because I want God to have some foothold in this, but even within their own arguments, they don't make sense. And I want to at least reveal this to you because I think it's kind of a kingpin of this thing, or it's a piece that if you understand, if you can kind of grab a hold of this, it helps make sense of a lot of the arguments you hear out there when it comes to faith and faith and science, religion and science, Christianity and science, as if they're incompatible in some way.
So let me speak on this. The whole idea that faith and science is incompatible is not necessarily true. I think that there are some portions of religious belief that are definitely affected by science, but the fact that there are religious people that are also scientific, I think shows that they're not necessarily in conflict. Now, that being said, the scientific method and the whole idea behind science is to be able to describe reality. So on a very overarching basic level, I believe that unjustified belief, which would be what most people would call faith, like a non-evidenced belief in something, I feel like that is anti-science. But that doesn't describe every Christian out there, nor every religious person, because there are people that think that they have the evidence to back up their claims that God exists. Now, if you're a Christian, science will definitely fuck you up, so science is caustic to that idea, but like just having a general belief in a God, I don't think is necessarily affected by science, because this is a deity that's supernatural, right? It exists outside of nature. Science is only meant to describe what's inside reality. So, I mean, if you place your God outside of reality, then you're right. There's no way that science can really describe that deity. But then how can you ever know whether or not that deity actually exists? So, I don't know. It's kind of a complex, nuanced discussion whether or not science is caustic towards faith. And I think that in some aspects, yes, it is. In other aspects, one doesn't affect the other. So, like, it's a complex conversation over that with many nuances.
I think that if we only use the kinds of questions that are being asked in these philosophical discussions like Russell's Teapot, we would never really understand the mysteries of the world well. And honestly, we probably never would have launched off this rock in the first place.
If everybody thought in the way that Russell's Teapot is presented, then we wouldn't have made it off the earth? I'm sorry, but I don't understand how you can actually say that. Because if you guys don't know what Russell's Teapot is it's a thought experiment meant to convey why people that don't believe in God don't believe in God. So you have theists out there that make the claim, well, God exists. Okay, great. Where's your evidence? Well, we don't really have physical evidence in that kind of way. This is, experience or something or another, magical miracles. Some guy had a short leg and now he's got a longer leg. That kind of thing. It's to illustrate the philosophic burden of proof. So you have the religious people that have a burden of proof to prove that their God exists. Just like with Bertrand Russell and his teapot, Bertrand Russell said, well, there's a teapot orbiting the sun in space somewhere around Mars. Or so it's been formulated different ways. But let's just say that, like, there's a teapot out there orbiting the sun. Okay? What evidence is there? If Bertrand Russell were to be like, no, you have to prove me wrong that there isn't a teapot orbiting the sun. That's a fallacy in logic. Like, that's a shifting of the burden of proof. Atheists aren't making a claim. We're just saying, I don't believe in your God. And religious people are saying, well, God exists. In order to make a positive claim like that, you shoulder the burden of proof. Now, when I say the Abrahamic God does not exist, then it's incumbent upon me to prove that he doesn't exist. And I think that I can do that fairly well just by using the Bible. The Bible is the requirements document for this deity. If the Bible and the requirements for this God fail in any kind of way, then the Bible doesn't describe the God that it was meant to describe, and therefore that God doesn't exist. Well, does the Bible fail to describe either God or this reality in some kind of way? Yes, it does, in multiple different ways. Historically, it's not accurate to what we have in history. There are minor, people and places that it gets right, but the overall message of the Bible is not congruent with what we know about history through archaeology as well as other disciplines in science. So the Bible cannot describe reality as it exists, as we experience it. So the God that it describes also is not real. So that's an overview of my argument against the Abrahamic God. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that you shoulder the burden of proof whenever you make a positive claim. Religious people are saying, hey, this God exists, so they have to prove with evidence that he does. And that's the purpose of Russell's Teapot. And apparently this has something to do with just not believing in a God.
So let me explain this. If you're saying that you have no evidence for something, for its existence, okay? You got that part, right? If you have zero evidence for the existence of something, in other words, no evidence that the teapot that's orbiting the sun somewhere near Mars, if you have no evidence that it exists, probably does not, if that's the thought process, that is to completely misunderstand an item called probability.
What? Where does probability get brought up in this? This is a philosophical thought experiment to explain the burden of proof. This is not anything about probability.
Probability is key. You use probability all the time, even though it's maybe not a word that you use all the time. But let me explain how probability works and how this helps us make sense of our faith in God as well as science and what science understands. For example, I have a coin here. If I were to spin the coin on this table, and when it stops, what would be the odds that it's going to be heads.
50%. Unless you want to count the, possibility that when you spin it, it's going to stay upright on its edge, which could happen. That's a little bit of a percent. But if we don't want to consider that possibility and just whether or not it lands on heads or tails, it would be 50%. Like, it's got a 50% chance because there are two sides to it and it's got to land on one of the two sides. And so you've either got heads or tails, unless it's not a quarter or something like that. And it's like one of those double-headed things that Two-Face has, but even Two-Face has a scratch side of it to denote, the bad side versus the good side. But even so, if you have a double-headed one, then it would 100% always land on heads. But let's assume that it's just a regular quarter or some other coin. It's got a heads and it's got a tails. It's got two different sides. And so it would be 50%. I don't know what this has to do with Russell's Teapot or atheism or science necessarily, but maybe he'll get there.
What is the probability that this coin is going to be heads? Now, there's evidence that could help you with this, right? What's some evidence that could help you to know if it landed heads or not?
You just fucking look at it. It's, kind of a visual inspection kind of thing at that point. You just look, oh, where did it land? Heads. What's this about a teapot again? How does this connect?
Yeah, there you go. Look at it. No, that's serious. That's evidence, right? Evidence. Came up and I examined. I go, that's heads. I know.
Fucking nailed it. I'm doing 100% on this test today. I know my probabilities.
Coin, so I know which one's the head and which is the tail. And yep, it's on heads. Maybe I could just tell you, friends, it landed on heads.
Well, if we're just going by that would be, if you were to factor in all of the different inputs and everything like that, you'd have to figure in, well, how reliable is this person? Is he likely to lie to me about whether or not it's heads? Even on a football game, when they're flipping to see who kicks or who receives, they flip it and then they have multiple people confirm that this is what it landed on and everything like that. So, I get that he's going for a very simplistic kind of example here, but once you start going into like, oh, well, I could just tell you what it landed on. Oh, well, then I have to consider what's the proclivity for you to lie to me. In the grand scope of reality, I guess it's still 50-50 as to whether or not it landed on heads. Then it's a totally separate thing for me to know whether or not it landed on heads. Like, that's a totally separate calculation that you'd have to run that would involve those factors that I listed, whether or not this guy's trustworthy, what kind of coin it is, and all this other stuff. Maybe I'm thinking a little bit too much into this, but I'm seeing where he's trying to be really simplistic about complex, like, shit. Also, how does this relate to Russell's Teapot? I don't fucking know.
Yeah. Send you a picture. Heads, right? So evidence helps you make a decision. If you have zero evidence, how can you know whether this coin landed on heads or not?
Well, how do you know it landed on heads or not? With the whole idea that I'm not going to be able to visually inspect it myself is a different matter that is more complex than just looking at the fucking coin.
This is where the problem comes in. With no evidence, by Russell's own question, if there's no evidence that it landed on heads, then it didn't.
No, that's not what Russell's Teapot means, for one. For two, it doesn't mean that, it didn't land on heads. It just means that we don't know if it landed on heads. Also, how does this relate back to the space program? Because you remember how he said that if we thought like Russell's Teapot, then we wouldn't have made it off of the Earth. And it's like, how does this relate back to the space program and us making it off the Earth? Is it because we've never been in space before? So I guess that means we can't go into space? That's also not what Russell's Teapot is meant to show you.
Or it's such a low probability that it did. Is that true?
Russell's Teapot has nothing to do with probability, and so you're just kind of pulling the whole probability aspect out of your ass right there up on stage. I feel like maybe this shouldn't be on YouTube with as much proctology as going on here.
If you have zero evidence, I'm telling you it landed on heads. But if you have no evidence that it landed on heads, what is the probability that it landed on heads? Is it super crazy low? So low that it might as well we just can say it didn't.
No, but also that's not what Russell's Teapot means. Russell's Teapot is just about providing proof for your claims. If your claim is it landed on heads, then we would need to see proof that it landed on heads. If you're not going to show us any kind of proof, then I would say that there's no way we can know for sure whether or not it fucking landed on heads. Now, does that mean that it didn't have an outcome at all? No, that's not what that means. It means that we don't know and we can't know because you won't provide the fucking evidence.
Because probability doesn't work that way, does it?
What? Probability doesn't work that way? What the fuck is he talking about? Like, considering the entire context of everything that he's talked about so far, he said probability doesn't work that way, huh? I guess he means that probability doesn't work in the way that, oh, now the coin just has no outcome after I flipped it because you can't know what it really landed on. No, that's not how probability works because probability isn't connected to that particular fucking situation.
Do you know what that thing is that you have in you that tells you there's another answer to this question?
Is it God's dick? I feel like the little thing inside me might be God's dick. I mean, this is a church after all.
Which is what? What's the probability that land on heads? Everybody said it first off early. 50-50. And why is it 50-50? Because there's only two options. It's going to fall one way or the other. Now, if I gave you a deck of cards, said pick a card, any card, what are the odds that the card that you would pull out of the deck would be a king that's red?
Okay, 2 over 52, which is what? 1 over 26, which is 3.8%. I mean, I either did the calculations earlier or I'm just good like that. I'm just good like that. Thank you, honey, for having so much faith in me.
That's closer to the existence of a teapot floating through space, orbiting the sun somewhere around Mars, or is it closer to a coin flip?
Considering Russell's teapot isn't meant to be anything about probabilities, isn't meant to be any kind of anything in the way of proving a God in this particular fashion, because of that, no, I mean, I can't see how it would be close to that probability. Like, is he saying that, oh, what's the probability of a teapot orbiting the sun versus the probability of a coin flip? Where does pulling a red king out of a deck of 52 cards, follow? Like, where does that lie on that line? I mean, yeah, there's nearly none to 50-50 or 50%. So it would definitely be closer to 50% no matter what it is, because the teapot doesn't have any kind of fucking probability associated with it.
You know that it's the coin flip, right? I mean, the odds of the teapot right now, a teapot currently flying through space. I'm telling you, you have to think logically, like this has actually happened. There is a teapot currently out there. Do you believe that?
Well, no, I don't, because it's a philosophical thought experiment to demonstrate the burden of proof. It's not meant to be a serious claim right now. The whole object of Russell's teapot is to show you how you have to prove it, just like Russell would have to prove that there's a teapot orbiting the sun. Now, is there a way that Russell could prove that? Sure. If the teapot is orbiting the sun the same way that Mars or any other planetary body is orbiting the sun, then you could easily take out a telescope and if you knew exactly where it was supposed to be, you could definitely look out into the night sky or the daytime, whenever in the fuck, and you could definitely see the fucking teapot. That's how you would prove it. It doesn't matter about like what's the proclivity for teapots to fly around space all willy-nilly. Like, we don't even have to go that far. We just have to get evidence that it actually exists. Just like with your card example here, we have evidence that a fresh 52 pack of cards has 2 red kings in it. That's how they are structured. That's how we know that there's 2 red kings in it. So, given that there are 2 red kings, the probability of pulling out 2 red kings is 3.8%. That literally is a probability, whereas Russell Teapot is just about fucking evidence. Where's your evidence? I feel like this guy doesn't know how to do fucking science. You just boil water in your teapot.
So are the odds that you're going to get a red king closer to that or closer to a coin 50-50 landing on heads?
Why does this even fucking matter?
It's got to be closer to the coin. You know that. Even though you maybe can't do the math. You're like, I don't know, but there's something I'm bringing to the table that with no evidence. I don't see the card, no evidence. I don't know what card I've drawn, no evidence at all, but I have a better feeling of probability that it's a red king connected to a coin flip kind of percentage than a teapot flying in outer space.
Well, you don't have evidence yet of what cards you're holding, but you do have evidence that fucking cards exist, for one, For 2, you have evidence that 2 red kings are commonly in a pack of cards. So a 3.8% chance that you have pulled a red king out of that pack of cards is a reasonable assessment. Now, you don't have evidence to believe that you have a red king yet. I mean, I guess if you wanted to believe on 3.8%, you could, but for me, that would not be enough for me to believe in something. We're talking about this in the larger context of God, right? If God had a 3.8% chance of existing, I would be like, I don't know. I'm gonna need to have better evidence. Let's say you turned over all the other cards instead of your card, and you only find 1 king. It would be reasonable then to believe that you have pulled 1 red king. This is all about how reasonable it is to believe in a claim, but more importantly, the importance of evidence that factors in to somebody believing in something. You have to have evidence first in order to analyze it.
Right? You know what your chance is? 3.8%. Zero evidence never concludes that the probability is so low that it doesn't exist.
I would agree that just because you don't have evidence of something doesn't mean that something didn't happen or doesn't exist. It just means that you don't have evidence of it. But it also means that if you don't have evidence of it, then there's no reason for you to believe it. Why would you believe in something if there's no evidence? That is a totally different thing than how likely is it that it happened. You can find incidental evidence or even tangential evidence that leads you in the direction of believing it, even though you don't have any direct evidence yourself of whatever in the fuck you're talking about. And then you could be justified in believing in something. But if you have zero evidence whatsoever, then there's no point in believing in that claim. Otherwise, you would end up believing in every claim out there that doesn't have evidence. Like the Loch Ness Monster has more evidence for it than fucking God. Do you believe in the Loch Ness Monster? I mean, I don't, because I don't have any good evidence that suggests that I should believe in it. So the amount of good evidence that exists that supports the conclusion that Loch Ness Monster exists, the amount of good evidence there leads me to not believe in it. It's not a matter of probabilities here. It's just that there's not enough evidence to warrant belief.
But no evidence also does not mean that something is guaranteed to be 50-50 or 100%. No evidence does not guarantee it doesn't exist. It also doesn't guarantee that it certainly does exist.
Okay, you've accomplished nothing in that particular sentence. We all know this. I feel like you're just filling time.
But when there's no evidence in play, the probability that you will use will depend on what the item is, right? A coin, different than a card, different than a floating teapot. You're going to use a different sense of probability when it comes to what the item is, very specifically.
Well, I mean, that's true, because each event is going to have different inputs and different situations that would dictate what the probability would be for some event. It's never going to be a 33% chance that, a coin flip is going to land on heads. I mean, it's a 50-50 thing. If you do enough samples of it, it eventually gets to, if you do the limit of coin flips, it eventually gets to a 50% number. As far as how many times it comes up heads and tails, it's going to be 50-50 when you go to infinity, right? So that's what that means. And so every situation is going to have different inputs. It's going to have different things that dictate what the likelihood is of some event happening. So yes, shit's different everywhere.
And this is a basic mathematical equation called prior probability. We all have prior probability on all things in life. We give things prior probability as we have evidence about them, things that we've learned in the past, but also just what we bring to the table. And we all bring some sense of understanding or logic to a certain situation that we're being asked to make a judgment on. With the coin, you have a prior probability of 50-50 odds because there's no other evidence in there, so 50-50 has to be the prior probability that you're going to bring to a coin flip, because just two sides of a coin flip equal either side. It could go either way, 50-50.
Well, I agree with him that the prior probability of a coin flip turning up to be heads is 50%. It kind of seems like he's starting down the path of Bayesian analysis concerning Russell's teapot or any other claim that we have. And I mean, I get a feeling that, most people use a Bayesian reasoning kind of way about, figuring out whether or not they believe something, believe anything like about God or anything like that. Because we consider, but before we start believing in something, we consider how likely it is to begin with, and then we take into account the evidence that's presented, and then we come out on the other side of it either believing in the thing or not believing in the thing. We do kind of have that general engine that's going as far as making decisions about what we believe and what we don't. But as far as like a detailed analysis like of the Russell's pot idea or anything like that, I mean, nobody's going into the nitty-gritty details of it, but the point is that you could figure up the prior probability of this. Hey, I know what. Let's think about the prior probability of a God existing. Well, the prior probability would have to be pretty close to 0% because every single God definition that humans have ever come up with or thought to have existed has ended up not being the true God that exists. So when you present me with this new God definition called the Abrahamic God, I have to start from a position with a probability that's so low because all of the other gods that have been presented have failed and they have not been real. So this one right here, it seems to be on a bad footing to begin with. And then you present your evidence that's supposed to overcome this prior probability. So yes, the probability that the Christian God exists is so close to 0 that it's negligible. Because while you should never pick 0 for any of these probabilities ever, the probability given all of the inputs that we've received in the past up until the point that the Abrahamic God was presented to us, seems to indicate that there aren't any gods that exist, or at least because of the fact that all these other gods have fallen away and these new gods have taken their place. What's the likelihood that they are the true gods? Well, it's not good, and you would need some pretty hefty evidence in order to overcome the prior probabilities of that, as far as his God goes. So if you want to talk prior probabilities, let's do it, but it's not going to work out well for you. And just because something has a supremely low prior probability doesn't mean that good evidence can't overcome that prior probability. If God had any kind of shred of evidence, it would overcome the overwhelming nature of its prior probability.
The Red King, you're going to give it a 3.8% chance, even if you weren't able to do the math. And if you weren't able to do the math, you at least knew it was closer to the coin flip than it was to the teapot. What about the teapot?
Oh, okay. Well, let's think about the teapot as far as prior probabilities go. There's currently a crazy, insane billionaire that loves to shoot things into outer space. Could he possibly have somehow discreetly shot a teacup into space, or a teapot into space? Could he have hidden one on the car that he shot into space? He seems to have a proclivity for shooting inanimate objects into orbit around our sun. So could he have done it? Yes, that factors into the prior probability. I mean, the fact that there's so much space garbage that we put up there could, in some way, could somebody have snuck a teapot onto one of those satellites and the satellite got knocked out of orbit? Sure, that's possible. So I don't, like, as far as a teapot in space, I feel like there's a vastly better probability, prior probability, than your God. So the likelihood that there's a teapot out there somewhere is higher than this guy would think. That's the point that I was trying to make.
Do you believe right now that the teapot is flying through space? What's your prior probability on that?
I don't think that we got to give you a prior probability, bro. I mean, as far as Russell Teapot goes, there's not a teapot with Russell's name on it out there, or anything that Russell could really assign to being a teapot that he put in space or anything like that, especially considering that it was a thought experiment, a philosophical thought experiment meant to show the burden of proof to religious people. It's not serious.
You have no evidence. There is no evidence that it's flying through space. You have no evidence. So what's your prior probability? Teapots just don't fly through space. NASA isn't going to do that. Elon Musk. Have not heard that Elon Musk has decided he's going to get all into launching teapots into outer space.
I do agree that everything that he's saying is a reasonable reason to not believe that there's a teapot flying or orbiting around the sun. Like, NASA is not going to put any kind of time or energy into it, although maybe one of the astronauts could get a little quirky about it and throw a teapot out there just because they're assholes or something. But saying that NASA hasn't put any energy into launching a teapot into orbit around the sun, I feel like is a reasonable thing. Elon Musk, we haven't directly heard of him putting one up there. So, I mean, the fact that there's no evidence that a teapot was launched in orbit around the sun is a good reason to not believe in the teapot. I totally agree with this, but it's also the same kind of reasoning I use for your God. There's no evidence to suggest that your God exists, so therefore, I don't believe in your God, just like you don't believe in a fucking teapot.
For all the things that we know and understand about our world and our culture and how things work and space and everything, the probability is incredibly low because of a prior probability we bring into it, not because we're judging it just based off of itself, right? It's ludicrous. And so it has a very low probability as we think about those kinds of things. It's not the lack of evidence that it's there that makes it a low probability. It's what we're being asked to consider, our prior probability that comes into the question itself. Flying spaghetti monster, same thing. It's not a lack of evidence that the flying spaghetti monster exists. You don't have to know anything about the flying spaghetti monster. And from what I've shared with you today, many of you are easily able to say the flying spaghetti monster does not exist.
But you see, that would be unreasonable at that point. Like, if you have no idea about the flying spaghetti monster, so what he's talking about is kind of a starting position. Until somebody tells you about a flying spaghetti monster, then there's no reason to think about a flying spaghetti monster existing. You effectively don't believe in it. And once you say, hey, there's a flying spaghetti monster out there that loves you and his noodly appendages keeps you pinned to the earth, and those that are shorter are more loved by the spaghetti monster than those that are taller. So, I mean, you could present to somebody a flying spaghetti monster, but then you would need to ideally back up that with evidence. And you can use the same kind, quality, and quantity of evidence for this flying spaghetti monster as you would for the Abrahamic God. The flying spaghetti monster has its own book that lays out its doctrines, its history, and all that kind of stuff, has its own creation myth and everything like that. You could argue in the exact same way for the flying spaghetti monster as you can for this dude's God, but yet he's acting like, oh, nobody has a problem disbelieving in the flying spaghetti monster. But is that a reasonable reason to disbelieve in the flying spaghetti monster? I do think that it's reasonable not to believe in it because nobody's presented evidence for it. But the thing is that if you present evidence for it and you compare that to the Abrahamic God, it's the same kind, quality, and quantity as their God. So he's in a predicament here.
Why? Because we know that organic life cannot just sprout up and spaghetti become a living deity. That's just not how things work. Even if you want to say flying spaghetti, we know that spaghetti isn't aerodynamic.
I mean, how do you know that? I mean, baseballs aren't necessarily aerodynamic, but I mean, a flying spaghetti monster could be aerodynamic in some kind of way. How do you know that, life can't form into noodles? We actually have evidence of noodly looking things existing on this earth. I mean, there's eels. Eels are kind of noodly. There's, let's see, tapeworms are noodly. So I'm just getting ramen noodles now. Here's a sea creatures that look delicious like Italian dishes. Ranked. This is from Vice, so you know it's good. Tomato clownfish. That's wrong. Sea cucumbers are kind of noodly. You don't know about that? I'm just saying, like, there's a lot of noodly creatures out there that, so to say that, oh, we know that organic life can't pop up that looks like a noodle. Oh, I didn't even bring this up. What about a fucking snake? That's a nope noodle if I've ever seen one. But in any case, my point is that he's not actually substantiating these claims. He's just piling more ad hoc claims on top of each other and claiming that they're evidence for this other thing. And so he's just making a harder case for himself. He would need to prove that noodly organisms can't exist or don't exist, which that's obviously wrong. And then he would also need to prove that noodly organisms are not aerodynamic in some kind of way. They would have to prove that they can't fly in some kind of way. Like, true, we don't have any evidence for any of that, for like an actual flying spaghetti monster. So it's unreasonable for you to believe in it, true. But he's saying we know it doesn't exist. He would have to prove that. That's a positive claim. Just because I don't believe in the flying spaghetti monster doesn't mean that I'm saying that, the flying spaghetti monster doesn't exist. It's just that we don't have any evidence to suggest that he does, right? It's the same fucking argument for God. By the way,
stupid as that is, there are all kinds of things that play into your prior probability that the flying spaghetti monster does not exist. You don't need any evidence to make that determination.
You do need evidence that he definitely doesn't exist. What you don't need evidence for is to not believe in the flying spaghetti monster. But if you were to say the flying spaghetti monster definitely doesn't exist, you would need evidence to prove that. This is why I'm still an agnostic atheist and not like a hard atheist, because I can't prove that a God in general doesn't exist. Like it exists outside of reality. There's no way for me to actually prove whether or not some deity is out there jerking it off to the universes that he created. I guess that's possible in the grand scheme of things, but there's also no reason for me to believe that. There's no reason for me to believe in some magical creature farting the universe out. There's no reason for me to believe that, so I don't believe in it. That doesn't mean that I know it doesn't exist. Just like for him, you would need evidence to say, I know that doesn't exist. You would need evidence for that. What you don't need evidence for is to say, I don't believe that.
It's a low probability. Nothing to do with evidence because of the prior probability of understanding that you have about any particular subject.
The prior knowledge that you have about any fucking subject proves that the flying spaghetti monster doesn't exist. So you have an intimate and extensive knowledge about fucking boxcars. That disproves the flying spaghetti monster. I feel like everything that he's saying right now, flying spaghetti monster, could be replaced with his God, and he would come away as a hard atheist knowing that his God doesn't exist.
The probability that something exists depends on the item that we're talking about. They're not equal. It's not apples for apples. It's not identical discussions. And a teapot flying through space is not an equal discussion of the God of the universe.
It's not meant to be. The philosophical thought experiment of Russell's Teapot is just meant to be an example of how you need proof for the claims that you're making. It's an example in the burden of proof. People making positive claims shoulder the burden of proof. If you're saying my God exists, then you shoulder the burden of proof in proving that your God exists. You shouldn't expect people to just believe your God exists because you say it exists. I mean, if that were the case, then you should also believe in every other God, including the flying spaghetti monster.
Though some might try to claim that it is, rational, basic, logical discussion will prove immediately that that is not the case. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
So I like that he says that here, and he's advocating for this, because this can be turned around on him for the flying spaghetti monster. Because he says no evidence is needed to know that the flying spaghetti monster doesn't exist. Well, then he says, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. This could easily be turned around on him for any other claim. Like the absence of evidence of the gods in polytheism, just because there's no evidence of them doesn't mean that they don't exist. So I guess the people that are heathens that subscribe to heathen religions, I guess they would be justified in believing in their God. And he's arguing about this from a very Christian perspective. So he's saying, well, just because there's no evidence of our God in the way that you need it to be, that doesn't mean he doesn't exist. It could also work for Russell's Teapot. Just because there's no evidence of Russell's Teapot doesn't mean that Russell's Teapot isn't there. He runs into a really big issue with this particular statement, and I don't think he understands exactly how bad of a problem that he has. Now, like I said before, this is a 40-minute sermon that I've distilled down into about 10 minutes, so I'm sure that I'm missing things on the outer edges. I cut out things and I denoted it with the fades to white within it so you could know that I was cutting it, but I only took out superfluous information within it. So this was the important parts of what he was talking about. So If you want to go and watch the full thing, I do have it linked down below. Hit that link and you'll be able to see the full 40-minute sermon. If you really want to watch it, it's really just about maybe a 30 or 35-minute sermon, because right there at the end, he gets people up on stage and they sing some shit. But if you really want to watch the rest of it, go and watch the rest of it. This is the bulk of what he was talking about here. So, I mean, take it for what you will. But in any case, that's going to be it for the video tonight. I hope that you heathens out there enjoyed tonight's show. But in any case, if you're leaving out right now, I hope that you enjoyed the stream today. And I guess I will be seeing you heathens later. Make sure you go down below, leave me a comment, let me know what you thought about this pastor's sermon. While you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.